What if I told you that the greatest empires fell not on the battlefield, but in the silence of city squares? Are you ready to learn the truth about the most calculated strategic decision of the 16th century?
They mean to harm us.
This position is critical.
The history of the conquest of the New World is often presented as a series of open, heroic clashes between two worlds. We are told of the clang of swords and the roar of cannons on vast fields. It seems that the outcome of great confrontations was always decided in fair, face-to-face combat. But the real turning point lies hidden behind the facade of peace talks and diplomatic smiles. The Conquistadors quickly realized that brute force does not always guarantee victory over an army of thousands.
Therefore, cunning and subtle political maneuvering on foreign soil came into play.
It is God's will. The Spaniards are in Cholula.
One such landmark event took place right in the heart of the Indians' religious center. This city was famous for its enormous temples and seemed to be the safest place for the local inhabitants.
The unsuspecting nobility and townspeople gathered in the square at the request of their European guests.
It was at that very moment that the carefully planned trap snapped shut. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how a preemptive strike in the sacred city forever changed the balance of power on the continent. I will reveal the best-kept secret of Hernán Cortés' political strategy. His campaign was built not on military superiority, but on a deep understanding of the internal divisions within a foreign empire. The expedition landed on the shore with a meager supply of resources and men. Instead of a direct assault, the Spaniards began weaving a complex web of alliances with discontented tribes. This approach required a perfect balance between a show of force and diplomatic flexibility. The alliance with the state of Tlaxcala was the first major triumph of this strategy. After a series of tense clashes, the former enemies realized the benefits of joint action against their dominant neighbor. The Tlaxcalans provided the Spaniards with thousands of warriors and invaluable knowledge of the region's geography. This agreement radically altered the scale of the threat facing the rulers in the empire's capital. Now, it was not merely a detachment of foreigners approaching the borders, but a massive combined army. Recognizing this new reality forced the capital to change tactics on the fly. Instead of sending troops, the ruler of Tenochtitlan chose the path of diplomatic traps and veiled threats. He suggested that the Spaniards change their route and stop at a major religious center. This city was renowned for its loyalty to the capital and its vast population.
Agreeing to this visit meant entering an area under the enemy's absolute control.
Cortés understood all the risks, but refusal would have looked like a sign of weakness. The advance continued amid an atmosphere of mounting psychological pressure and mutual suspicion. The army entered the new lands with the utmost caution and readiness for any surprises. The landscape changed, and instead of open spaces, the expedition was surrounded by dense urban structures. The architecture was overwhelming in its grandeur, emphasizing the host power. Legends often attribute the conquistadors' actions to divine providence or sheer luck. An analysis of historical documents reveals the commander's exceptionally pragmatic and cold-blooded calculation. The situation demanded an unconventional response capable of thwarting the host plans.
The threat was real, and traditional defense methods led to inevitable defeat.
A moment was brewing that would forever change the rules of the game on this continent. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on these historical events. What do you think about the strategy of exploiting internal conflicts to conquer new territories? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion will help us better understand the nature of political alliances of the past. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new historical investigations. Every subscription helps us create more high-quality and in-depth content. What I'm about to show you is banned in 12 countries as an example of the ideal political coup. Finding himself in the center of a hostile city, Cortés realized the need for radical measures. Waiting for an open attack would deprive his unit of its main advantage. That advantage was organization and the ability to act preemptively. The command decided to launch a preemptive strike against the decision-making centers. 16. The plan required precision and absolute secrecy during the preparation phase. The city's elite and military leaders were invited to a closed-door meeting in the inner courtyard of the temple complex. The official pretext was negotiations regarding the resumption of food supplies and the expedition's future route. The local nobility arrived at the meeting unarmed, confident in their numerical superiority beyond the complex walls. This was a fatal mistake, based on an underestimation of the enemy's resolve. The Spaniards' allies, who had been waiting outside the city, entered the streets to secure the victory.
Their task was to suppress pockets of spontaneous resistance and take control of resources.
The change in power occurred rapidly, transforming the city's status from an enemy outpost to conquered territory. The surviving members of the local administration were forced to acknowledge the new political realities. The balance of power in the region had irrevocably shifted in favor of the expedition. News of what had happened spread faster than the swiftest messengers could travel. For the empire's capital, this came as a genuine shock and a cause for panic. The impregnable city, which had served as a spiritual and military shield, had fallen without a prolonged siege. The ruler's psychological barrier was shattered by this cold efficiency. Now the path to the empire's main center was practically open. The destruction of the leadership in Cholula became a classic example of intimidation. The Conquistadors demonstrated that any secret conspiracies would be crushed by the harshest methods.
This show of force was directed not so much at the local inhabitants as at the emperor in distant Tenochtitlan.
It is interesting to consider how this issue is viewed from the perspective of modern diplomacy. Are preventive actions justified if they avert an even greater strategic catastrophe? This question continues to spark debate among historians. Want to know the secret that changed the entire future fate of the empire's capital? Watch the video until the next chapter to understand how this triumph turned into a sophisticated trap. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the unique use of urban architecture against its very creators. Tenochtitlan was a masterpiece of engineering, built on water. The city was connected to the mainland by a complex system of dams and drawbridges. This island isolation seemed to the inhabitants to be an absolute guarantee of safety from external threats. However, the Spanish command saw a fatal vulnerability in this brilliant solution. After the events in Cholula, the expedition approached the capital unhindered. Moctezuma, overwhelmed by the previous news, personally went out to meet the uninvited guests. The conquistadors' position was incredibly precarious and depended on the mood of the crowd. Around the palace, the life of a vast city numbering hundreds of thousands of inhabitants was in full swing. Any order from the ruler could instantly cut off all routes of retreat.
The dams were controlled by local troops, and the lake was patrolled by thousands of warboats.
The situation demanded an immediate change in the rules governing control over this territory. Using the legitimate ruler as a puppet gave the expedition incredible advantages. The Spaniards gained access to state treasuries and maps of gold mines. The opposition-minded nobility was disoriented and unable to organize a rebellion against the emperor's will. The state apparatus worked to enrich and strengthen the invaders' positions. It was a period of illusory stability and total control. However, such a system of governance could not last forever. Tension among the local aristocracy grew with each passing day. Priests and military leaders began secretly gathering forces to change the situation. Cultural and religious conflicts between the guests and the hosts were intensifying.
The capital was slowly turning into a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark.
Analysis of that time shows that the Spaniards became overly confident in their invincibility. They began imposing their own rules and interfering with ancient rituals. The island city was transforming from a comfortable fortress into a trap for the conquerors themselves. This chapter proves that intellectual superiority is more important than numerical superiority. Be sure to like this video if you enjoy in-depth analysis of political intrigue. Your support helps the channel grow and produce new content. It's important for us to know that this format of historical investigations is of interest to our audience. Please leave your ratings so we can make the content even better. Something you've never seen before happened at the moment of the Spanish garrison's greatest vulnerability. Cortés was forced to leave the capital with part of his troops to deal with external issues. A small detachment under the command of a less experienced officer remained in Tenochtitlan. It was during this period that a major religious festival was scheduled to take place in the city. The local nobility requested permission to hold mass celebrations in the central square. Permission was granted, but the garrison was in a state of extreme paranoia. The officers suspected that the festival was merely a cover for a large-scale armed uprising. When thousands of members of the elite gathered in the temple courtyard, the commanders lost their nerve. A disastrous decision was made to launch a preemptive strike, repeating the scenario of Cholula. However, the circumstances and scale of the event differed radically from previous experience. During one of his addresses to the crowd, the ruler suffered severe injuries and soon died. This event created a complete political vacuum in the empire. There were no longer any restraining factors, and the uprising entered a phase of total annihilation of the invaders. Urban architecture became the rebels' main ally. Bridges on the dams were destroyed, isolating the island from the mainland. Spanish troops found themselves trapped in a stone bag under constant pressure from vastly superior forces. Firearms and cavalry lost their effectiveness in close-quarter street fighting. The situation worsened by the hour, turning the residents into a hopeless trap. The command realized that holding their positions would lead to the complete annihilation of the unit. The only way out was an immediate breakthrough through enemy lines. Preparations for the retreat were carried out under the strictest secrecy and extreme tension. Portable bridges were constructed from the timber of the palace buildings to cross the destroyed sections of the dam. Gold and jewels were distributed among the soldiers, weighing them down at the most critical moment. The departure was scheduled for the dead of night to use the darkness as cover. The army was preparing for the most grueling ordeal in the entire history of the campaign. The order of march was instantly disrupted, and the organized retreat turned into a chaotic breakout. Do you think this strategic mistake could have been avoided? In the next chapter, you will learn how this fateful night ended. The retreat along the narrow causeway went down in history as the darkest chapter of the conquest. The water barrier became an insurmountable obstacle for the overburdened soldiers and horses. Portable bridges got stuck in the silt or collapsed under the weight of the crowd. The columns stretched for kilometers, losing control and communication between units. The onslaught from the water was relentless and merciless. In the midst of utter chaos, everyone fought solely for their own survival. Heavy armor and looted gold dragged men to the bottom of the dark lake. The organized army had broken down into scattered groups trying to reach the safety of the shore. The command structure had collapsed, leaving the soldiers to fend for themselves. It was a moment of near-total strategic and moral collapse for the expedition. Despite the dire situation, the command managed to rally the remnants of their forces into a single unit. On the Otumba plain, the pursuers attempted to crush the fugitives once and for all. The Empire's massive army blocked the path of the exhausted Spanish detachment. It was a clash of absolute despair against absolute confidence in victory. However, the Conquistadors employed a tactic of a concentrated cavalry strike against the enemy's command center. Their presence among their allies allowed them to begin the process of slowly restoring their combat effectiveness. Diplomatic efforts resumed with redoubled energy. The Spaniards convinced neighboring tribes of the need to overthrow the dominant empire. A new, even larger coalition of discontented city-states was taking shape. The strategy of political division once again became Cortés' main weapon. At the same time, the rearmament and reorganization of army structures began. New units were formed in the camp, and allied troops were trained. The command developed a fundamentally new plan to capture the island capital. The lessons of past mistakes dictated the need to change the siege tactics. The focus was on completely blocking Tenochtitlan's supply routes. A large-scale operation was being prepared, one without precedent in the continent's military history. Deep in the rear, construction began on a flotilla of collapsible patrol boats. These ships were intended to secure control of the lake and cut off supply lines. The expedition shifted from attempts at a rapid capture to a strategy of methodical strangulation. The stakes in this conflict reached their historic peak. What would happen if no one learned of this invisible factor that determined the fate of an entire continent? While the Spaniards were regrouping, a catastrophe of a different kind was unfolding in the empire's capital. The joy of expelling the foreigners proved short-lived and gave way to a profound demographic crisis. Along with the Conquistadors, a completely new invisible enemy arrived on the continent. The immune systems of the local inhabitants faced a challenge for which they were unprepared. An unknown disease began to spread rapidly through the overcrowded neighborhoods of Tenochtitlan. The island's isolation, which had saved the city from enemy armies, facilitated the rapid spread of the disease. Traditional medicine proved utterly powerless in the face of this new threat. The fabric of society began to unravel under the weight of massive losses among the working-age population. The city was losing its defenders faster than in any large-scale battle. Spanish troops and thousands of allies blocked all the dams leading to the capital. The aqueduct that supplied fresh water to the island was destroyed in the very first days. Attempts to break through the blockade were suppressed by artillery fire from patrol ships. The city found itself in a state of slow suffocation, deprived of vital resources. Cortés' strategy was utterly ruthless and mathematically precise. Every day of the siege diminished the garrison's defensive capabilities. The defenders were forced to drink unsuitable water, which only worsened the overall situation. Internal food supplies were rapidly dwindling, causing widespread exhaustion. The besieged made desperate attempts to break through the blockade, but to no avail. Local successes merely delayed the outcome without changing the strategic picture. The empire's resources were exhausted, and no outside aid arrived. The balance of power had definitively shifted in favor of the invading army. Tenochtitlan was living out its final weeks in a state of complete isolation. How do you assess the impact of a logistical blockade on the outcome of such conflicts? In the next chapter, you will learn what the final chapter of this long siege was like. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not a single, decisive event. It stretched out over many long months of agony. The Spanish methodically advanced toward the city center, capturing block by block. The destruction of the infrastructure deprived the defenders of the ability to use their usual urban warfare tactics. Every building that posed a threat was razed to the ground by the Allied forces. All that remained of the majestic metropolis was a scorched wasteland in the ruins of its former grandeur. The scale of the destruction was beyond the imagination of their contemporaries. All that remained of the grand capital with its palaces and temples were ruins on a muddy island. The victors gained control of the territory, but the city's wealth had largely vanished. Many valuables were lost in the lake or destroyed during the relentless fighting. The region's economic infrastructure was completely paralyzed. The Spaniards' allies viewed the city's fall as their own great victory. The Tlascalans and other tribes, who had paid heavy tribute for years, reveled in their triumph over their former dominant neighbor. However, they did not yet realize that the change in power would not bring them the long-awaited freedom. The new administration quickly began to establish its own harsh tax system. The roles had changed, but the essence of subjugation remained the same. Immediately after the victory, the distribution of the conquered territories among the expedition's participants began. Commanders were given entire provinces with thousands of local inhabitants to govern. A system of colonial land ownership was formed, providing the economic foundation for the new regime. This process was accompanied by strict control and the suppression of any attempts at disobedience. The conquest smoothly transitioned into a phase of systematic colonization of the continent. An analysis of these events shows that the Spaniards' military success was merely the tip of the iceberg. The true victory was achieved in the realms of politics, logistics, and psychology. Cortés masterfully exploited all of the enemy's weaknesses and contradictions. He turned the empire's internal conflicts into the primary instrument of its destruction. This campaign became a textbook example of asymmetric strategy. The consequences of the capital's fall were felt for many decades. The old elite was removed from power or assimilated by the new regime. The cultural and administrative landscape of the continent underwent a radical transformation. A period of active construction of new cities on the ruins of old civilizations began. The face of the world changed forever, leaving the great pre-Columbian states in the past. The history of conquest reminds us of the fragility of any political system. Even the most powerful empire can collapse under the influence of a complex set of internal and external factors. It is important to understand the mechanisms that lead to such large-scale structural changes. Studying these processes helps us draw lessons from a complex historical past. Historical memory serves as the foundation for understanding the laws of human society's development. After establishing control over the ruins, Cortés decided to build a new capital on the same site. This was an important political gesture demonstrating the continuity of power and total domination. The lake was gradually drained and new administrative buildings were erected from the stones of the old temples. Construction was carried out by the local population under conditions of strict forced labor. The new city was to become a stronghold of European influence in a vast region. Spain's administrative machinery quickly became involved in governing the new territories. Official courts were established, and officials and tax collectors were appointed. The authority of the field commanders was gradually replaced by the crown's more systematic bureaucratic apparatus. This caused tension among the expedition's veterans, who considered themselves the true masters of the conquered territories. Political intrigues within the victor's camp became increasingly tangled. The social structure of the new society was built on a strict hierarchy and lineage. At the top of the pyramid were representatives of the metropolis, who held absolute administrative power. The local population was integrated into the system as the primary labor force. When analyzing the scale of the campaign, researchers are still struck by the combination of factors that led to its success. Technological superiority played a role, but it was not the sole determining factor in the long run. The main weapon turned out to be the ability to quickly adapt to the changing conditions of an unknown environment. Understanding the enemy's social structure and the ability to exploit its weaknesses determined the outcome of the campaign. It was a triumph of sophisticated strategy over a static command system. The memory of Cholula and the fall of the capital has remained forever in the historical consciousness of the region's peoples. These events are perceived as a turning point in history that altered the fate of millions. The collapse of ancient civilizations left a deep structural imprint on the social fabric of modern society. Today, we can view these events as a complex chess game, analyzing the moves and strategies. Understanding the mechanics of conquest allows us to better grasp the universal laws governing the formation of large states. History requires a deep immersion in the context of the era and a rejection of simplified models. Only in this way can we extract genuine analytical meaning from humanity's past experience. This knowledge serves as a reliable tool for analyzing the mechanisms of power and control. The conquest of Tenochtitlan triggered a chain reaction of expeditions across the North American continent. Detachments began venturing deep into unexplored territories, employing well-established tactical patterns. The conquerors sought new centers of power to replicate the successful scenario of rapid subjugation. The model of forming alliances with discontented peripheral tribes was applied everywhere with varying degrees of effectiveness. The expansion of the new colonial empire's borders proceeded continuously and quite systematically. Internal logistics for the vast territories under control posed a serious challenge for the royal administration. Delivering official orders and cargo took months, which significantly slowed the response to local crises. The construction of a reliable road infrastructure became a priority for strengthening central authority. The security of long trade routes was maintained through strict control measures and regular patrols. The region's economic stability depended entirely on the uninterrupted operation of these transport arteries. Parallel to administrative control was a profound physical transformation of the landscape itself. The introduction of European farming methods and large-scale livestock raising radically altered the balance of the continent's ecosystem. The historical scale of the early 16th century campaign cannot be assessed solely in military terms. The decisions made during the expedition shaped the political and economic geography for centuries to come. The tactic of targeted political pressure proved incredibly effective in dismantling large hierarchies. It became a structural template for many of the crown's subsequent territorial and political acquisitions. The study of these administrative methods remains relevant for understanding the mechanisms of state building. The events in Cholula became the very critical precedent that set the entire mechanism of expansion in motion. Without this demonstrative shift in the balance of power, the political map might have unfolded quite differently. This underscores the immense significance of the psychological factor in large-scale processes of power transition. The ability to undermine an opponent's confidence in their own security often proves more effective than a direct siege. This lesson in strategic planning was meticulously documented by royal chroniclers. Ultimately, the empire was defeated by its own sluggishness and the inflexibility of its governance system. The reliance on traditional methods of diplomacy suffered a systemic collapse when confronted with pure pragmatism. Intellectual superiority and analyzing vulnerabilities proved to be the decisive factor in the final success. This story clearly demonstrates that the winner is the one who adapts more quickly to the rules of the new political reality. The process of changing eras cannot be stopped once systemic changes have already begun. Summing up this grand historical transformation, we see a complex mechanism of change in the world order. The fall of Tenochtitlan brought to a close an entire era that had begun long before the arrival of the first European expeditions. Continental political isolation was shattered in a few years of continuous strategic expansion. The old centers of absolute power vanished, giving way to new nodes in a global administrative network. The geography of control over resources underwent the most radical transformation in the region's entire documented history. Cortés's campaign demonstrated the critical vulnerability of strictly centralized systems to non-standard threats. The concentration of all power in the hands of a small circle of individuals became the main systemic weakness of the vast state. The elimination of leaders led to the instantaneous collapse of the entire hierarchy and a loss of coordination. This systemic failure allowed a small group of professionals to crush the colossal state apparatus. The empire's organized and rigid structure turned against its own security. The tragedy of Cholula remains a striking example of the use of harsh measures as a tool of high politics. This action was a cold-blooded strategic calculation aimed at breaking the established diplomatic framework. Demonstrating a willingness to act outside expected rules shattered the enemy leadership's moral resolve. The resulting psychological paralysis proved more effective than prolonged sieges and logistical blockades. The boundaries of what was permissible in systemic confrontation were irrevocably pushed to new limits. Studying such historical turning points requires moving beyond a simplistic, emotional perception of the past. Each involved party acted within its own logic and pursued fundamental survival interests. A focus on the moral aspect of the issue often hinders an objective understanding of the mechanisms behind difficult managerial decisions. The clash became a process of fierce systemic competition for dominance in a changing environment. In this large-scale struggle, the systems with the highest degree of adaptability survived and established themselves. Historians continue to observe and deeply analyze the consequences of this geopolitical shift to this day. The structure of the region's modern administrative borders bears a clear imprint of those distant strategic decisions. The mistakes of Cortés' expedition were thoroughly examined in the metropolis's headquarters to prevent future crises. New detailed instructions and laws were developed to regulate the complex process of territorial administration. A true applied science of establishing and maintaining control over distant colonies took shape. This chronicle serves as a reminder that no large-scale historical process is a rigidly predetermined scenario. At any critical moment, there are numerous possible outcomes, depending on the will of key participants. Strategic miscalculations, personal ambitions, and logistical problems play a huge role in shaping the outcome. The course of a campaign could change dramatically due to a multitude of unforeseen factors, leading to entirely different political configurations. It is precisely this variability that makes studying the past such an important analytical endeavor. More often than not, these are decided behind the scenes, through cold calculations and ruthless actions. What other historical campaigns or pivotal political events would you like to see analyzed in the same strategic light? Suggest your topics for future videos in the comments below this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to always be the first to access our in-depth analysis of history.